In the shadow of the great battles of the 20th century, another war was unfolding, a war for human consciousness. The USSR created a unique weapon that did not kill the body, but broke the spirit of the enemy. Loudspeakers capable of driving an entire army mad. Fake newspapers indistinguishable from the real thing. Ghost radio stations broadcasting from nowhere. From the death Metronome near Stalingrad to secret psychotronic laboratories in the Siberian taiga, the history of Soviet psychological weapons is full of mysteries and discoveries. How did sound become a weapon? How did words become ammunition? And why does technology from 70 years ago determine the information wars of today? Get ready to learn the truth about the USSR's most secret weapon, a weapon that fought against the human soul. Subscribe to our channel. Here we reveal the most classified pages of history. And in the comments, we will discuss a controversial question. Did Soviet scientists have the right to conduct experiments on the human psyche, even in the name of defending their homeland? Where is the line between protection and mind control? The 1920s. The young Soviet Republic was looking for new ways to defend itself and attack. In the secret offices of the People's Commissars, ideas were born that seemed fantastic, even for that time. One of them was the use of sound as a weapon. The first theoretical developments appeared at the Frunze Military Academy. A group of officers led by Colonel Alexander Ivanovich Petrov studied the possibilities of psychological warfare. They analyzed the experience of World War I, when British and French troops first used loudspeakers to demoralize German soldiers. Soviet military theorists went further. They proposed creating a systematic program of psychological influence based on scientific principles. The underlying idea was that the human psyche has vulnerable points, and sound could be the key to these points. The first experiments were conducted in strict secrecy. Powerful loudspeakers were installed at a testing ground near Moscow, and their effect on volunteers from military academies was tested. The results exceeded expectations. Monotonous sounds of a certain frequency caused anxiety, fear, and sometimes panic in the test subjects. At the same time, work was underway to study the impact of the printed word. Specialists from the main Directorate of Political Propaganda developed methods for creating convincing forgeries. They studied the enemy's fonts, paper, and printing technologies. The goal was to create printed materials that were indistinguishable from the original, but carried completely different content. By the end of the 1920s, a unique school of psychological warfare had formed in the USSR. Its founders understood that in future conflicts, victory would not go to the physically stronger side, but to those who could break the enemy's spirit. This philosophy became the foundation for the creation of a powerful system of psychological influence. Particular attention was paid to training personnel. Special schools trained officers who were not only knowledgeable in military matters, but also in the basics of psychology, sociology, and journalism. These people were to become soldiers on the invisible front, where words and sounds were their weapons. Theoretical developments gradually moved into the practical realm. The first prototypes of special equipment were created, and methods of application were developed. The USSR was preparing for a new type of war, a war for the minds and hearts of the people. And this preparation very quickly proved its effectiveness on the fields of real battle. In a village near Moscow, whose name is still classified, there was a special-purpose research and development facility. Officially, it was listed as an experimental communications station. In reality, a fundamentally new weapon was being created here, a weapon for waging war on the human mind. The project was led by engineer Colonel Grigory Semyonovich Morozov, a graduate of the Petrograd Technological Institute. His team consisted of radio engineers, acousticians, psychologists, and even musicians. Everyone contributed to the creation of what would later be called sound artillery. The first loudspeaker prototypes were primitive. They were huge sheet metal horns mounted on car chassis. Their power was low, only a few watts, but even these simple devices showed surprising results in experiments on people. Morozov and his team tested different types of sounds. A monotonous low-frequency hum caused anxiety and restlessness. High-frequency squeaks led to headaches and irritation. But the most effective was a rhythmic beating that imitated a heartbeat. People exposed to it began to experience panic. At the same time, experiments were conducted with speech. The voices of professional announcers were recorded as they read texts in German, Polish, and Finnish. The content varied from calls to surrender to terrifying stories about the fate of prisoners of war. These recordings were played through loudspeakers at various distances. Particular attention was paid to studying the acoustic properties of the terrain. Engineers discovered that sound propagates differently in wooded areas, creating a voice-from-nowhere effect. In the mountains, sound waves bounced off the slopes, creating multiple echoes. These features were taken into account when developing tactics for the use of sound weapons. By 1935, a powerful experimental loudspeaker system had been created at the test site. Its range reached 5 kilometers. During tests, the announcer's voice was clearly audible at a distance of 3 kilometers, and a monotonous hum spread even further. The results of the experiments were so impressive that the leadership decided to mass-produce similar devices. The development of various modifications began, ranging from portable megaphones for infantry to powerful stationary complexes for the defense of fortified areas. The USSR was preparing to use its secret weapon in real combat. June 22, 1941, the Great Patriotic War began, and along with tanks, planes, and artillery, an invisible weapon entered the battle: sound. But the first months of the war showed that the Soviet troops were not fully prepared for psychological warfare. The German army proved to be more experienced in the use of propaganda and psychological pressure. The Nazis used loudspeakers to broadcast speeches in Russian, urging Red Army soldiers to surrender. They promised good food, warm barracks, and a quick end to the war. These broadcasts were carried out around the clock on all sections of the front. The first Soviet countermeasures were chaotic and ineffective. Political workers simply shouted patriotic slogans into loudspeakers. The equipment was primitive: ordinary army megaphones and homemade amplifiers. The range did not exceed 100 meters. German installations worked at a distance of up to a kilometer. The turning point came in October 1941 near Moscow. The Western Front Command received several experimental powerful loudspeaker installations created during peacetime. They were first used against German positions near the village of Kryukovo. The effect exceeded all expectations. For 3 nights in a row, Soviet devices broadcast recordings of the moans of the wounded, the cries of German women and children, and funeral marches. A monotonous voice in German reported on the huge losses of the Wehrmacht, on the frost that would soon strike, and on the fact that German families had forgotten their soldiers. Panic gripped the German positions. Soldiers refused to stand guard duty, complaining of insomnia and nervous breakdowns. The enemy command was forced to withdraw its units 200 meters back, away from the source of psychological influence. This success led to the rapid deployment of special loudspeaker systems. By the end of 1941, mobile truck-based systems, trench installations for positional warfare, and even special sound mines, camouflaged loudspeakers that activated when the enemy approached, appeared in the troops. Special psychological warfare units were created. Their fighters studied languages, psychology, and acting. They recorded the voices of German prisoners who talked about the good conditions in Soviet captivity. Programs were prepared that imitated German radio, but with distorted information about the situation at the front. The war of sound became increasingly sophisticated. Soviet specialists studied the peculiarities of the German psyche and began to use them against the enemy. The Germans were afraid of Russian frosts, so it was necessary to tell them about the harsh winter that awaited them. They longed for home, so it was worth broadcasting letters from relatives. Stalingrad, autumn 1942. In the ruins of a city where every house had become a fortress and every street a battlefield, one of the most brutal and effective psychological warfare operations was born. Its author was Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Konstantinovich Sukhov, a graduate of the Leningrad Conservatory and a communications officer. The idea came to Sukhov during another sleepless night in the basement of a ruined house on the banks of the Volga. German snipers controlled almost all the streets of the city. Every 7 seconds, Soviet soldiers were dying somewhere. And then the lieutenant suggested turning this terrible rhythm of death into a psychological weapon against the enemy. The technical implementation of the idea was simple, but ingenious. They took a regular metronome, a device for measuring musical tempo. They connected it to a powerful amplifier and loudspeaker. The device was placed in the ruins of a house on Mamayev Kurgan, from where the sound could be heard at German positions. On October 21st, at midnight sharp, the monotonous ticking of the metronome sounded over Stalingrad for the first time. 7 beats, then a pause. 7 beats, then a pause. And during each pause, the announcer's voice rang out in perfect German. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies at the front. Stalingrad is a mass grave. The effect exceeded even the wildest expectations. German soldiers, already exhausted by months of fighting in the city ruins, began to go mad from this monotonous reminder of death. The metronome worked around the clock, interrupted only to change the recording plates. The command of the 6th German Army tried to drown out the Soviet broadcast with their own loudspeakers, but to no avail. The sound of the metronome was simple and piercing, penetrating through any interference. Attempts to destroy the device with artillery fire also failed. Soviet engineers constantly changed its location. A week after the start of the operation, German doctors recorded a sharp increase in the number of nervous disorders among soldiers. Many refused to go out on night patrols, complaining of hallucinations and insomnia. Some began to involuntarily count the seconds, waiting for every 7th beat of the metronome as a signal of their death. The Soviet command decided to increase the psychological pressure. Other sound effects were added to the metronome. The howling of wind in the ruins, the cries of the wounded, distant explosions. Sometimes the broadcasts were interrupted by letters from home, texts recorded by Soviet actors about how German families were suffering from Allied bombing. Operation Metronome became a classic example of psychological warfare, a simple technical idea based on a deep understanding of human psychology demoralized an entire army. Many military historians believe that this operation contributed to the final defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad. After the war, the Stalingrad metronome method was studied in military academies around the world. It showed that psychological weapons could be just as destructive as artillery or aviation, and that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most effective. By the middle of the Great Patriotic War, it had become clear that psychological weapons required a serious technical base. Primitive loudspeakers and homemade amplifiers could no longer compete with German technology. Fundamentally new solutions were needed, and Soviet engineers created them. At the Design Bureau of the Krasny Luch factory in Leningrad, a group led by engineer Alexei Borisovich Romanov developed the first mass-produced powerful loudspeaker system, the MGU-42. Despite the blockade, the factory managed to produce 12 units of this unique equipment. The MGU-42 was an off-road vehicle with a powerful amplifier and a system of 4-horn loudspeakers installed in the body. Power was supplied by a special generator. The range of clear speech reproduction was 2 kilometers, and loud sounds could be heard up to 4 kilometers away. But the main achievement was not the increase in power, but the quality of sound reproduction. the engineers managed to transmit the human voice with virtually no distortion. This made it possible to create more sophisticated psychological programs based on intonation and emotional nuances of speech. At the same time, specialized modifications were being developed. The OGU-42 trench loudspeaker system was designed for positional warfare. Its loudspeakers were disguised as ordinary defensive structures and could operate in automatic mode, playing pre-recorded programs. Small sound mines were particularly popular. These were disguised loudspeakers with a remote control system. They were buried in the ground in the neutral zone. When German scouts approached Soviet positions, operators activated the mines, and voices demanding that they stop and surrender were heard across the battlefield. The creation of a directional sound system was revolutionary. Using parabolic reflectors, Soviet engineers learned to focus sound waves in a narrow sector. This made it possible to deliver messages to specific enemy groups without alerting the rest to the psychological warfare being conducted. In 1944, the first models of multi-channel installations appeared. They could simultaneously broadcast different programs in several languages or create complex soundscapes. For example, they could imitate the approach of large tank formations, supplementing the real sounds of military equipment with recorded effects. A qualitative leap occurred with the introduction of magnetic recording. Whereas previously it was necessary to use gramophone records with limited playing time, it was now possible to record programs lasting several hours on metal tape. This opened up new possibilities for creating complex psychological scenarios. By the end of the war, the Soviet sound artillery had become a high-tech system. The troops had more than 300 different loudspeaker systems, from portable megaphones to powerful stationary complexes. They played an important role in demoralizing the enemy and bringing victory closer. While engineers were perfecting acoustic weapons, an equally important battle was unfolding in the secret printing houses of the USSR. The war of fake newspapers and leaflets. This invisible struggle required no less skill than the creation of complex technology. Here, every detail, from the quality of the paper to the characteristics of the font, could determine the success or failure of an operation. The center of this activity was a special department under the main political administration of the Red Army, created in August 1941. It was headed by Colonel Ivan Petrovich Kalugin, who in peacetime worked as the editor of a Moscow newspaper. Under his leadership, a unique laboratory for the production of counterfeit printed materials was created. The first task was to study the German press. Soviet intelligence agents delivered samples of newspapers from occupied territories and neutral countries. Specialists analyzed everything from the composition of the paper to the characteristics of the typesetting. It turned out that each German newspaper had its own distinctive features, which were not easy to fake. Reproducing the paper was particularly difficult. The Germans used special grades with a specific content of wood pulp and rag fiber. It took Soviet chemists several months to create a similar material. They had to set up the production of special grades of paper at 2 factories near Moscow. The fonts were just as important. German newspapers used Gothic and Latin fonts, many of which didn't exist in the USSR. They had to make new typefaces, cast letters, and teach typesetters how to work with unfamiliar symbols. This work was done in strict secrecy in specially equipped workshops. The content of the fake newspapers was developed by a group of journalists and psychologists. They studied the style of German publications, the peculiarities of presenting material, and characteristic turns of phrase. The fakes had to be indistinguishable from the originals in form, but radically different in content. The first samples of fake German newspapers appeared in December 1941. Outwardly, they were completely identical to the originals. The same format, the same fonts, the same design elements. But instead of optimistic reports from the front, readers found information about the terrible losses of the Wehrmacht, uprisings in Germany, and the imminent victory of the Allies. fake letters proved particularly effective. Soviet specialists learned to imitate handwriting, create family photographs, and use real German postage stamps and envelopes. These letters from relatives reached German soldiers through an agent network and contained demoralizing information about the situation in the rear. The production of fake printed materials quickly expanded. By the end of 1942, various printing houses in the USSR were producing up to 500,000 copies of fake German newspapers, leaflets, and brochures every month. These materials were distributed through partisan detachments and agents, and even dropped from planes over German positions. The success of the print war was obvious. The German command was forced to spend significant resources on combating Soviet disinformation. Special services were created to identify counterfeit materials, and severe penalties were introduced for reading and distributing them. But it was impossible to stop the flow. In a small mansion on Ostozhenka, officially listed as the Scientific Research Institute of Polygraphy, worked the most secret printing house in the Soviet Union. Here worked true masters of their craft, people capable of forging any printed material so that it was virtually impossible to distinguish it from the original. This unique team was led by Alexander Nikolaevich Fedotov, formerly one of the best engravers at Goznak. His team consisted of artists, chemists, photographers, and even jewelers. Each was a master of the highest order in their field, and they were all united by a single goal: to create perfect forgeries for the purposes of psychological warfare. The work began with a detailed study of the originals. Each German newspaper underwent a comprehensive analysis. Artists studied the font design, the layout of the materials on the page, and the characteristic design elements. Chemists analyzed the composition of the paper and ink. Photographers studied the features of the reproduction of illustrations. Particular attention was paid to small details that usually escape attention. For example, it turned out that German printing houses used a special method of cutting newspaper sheets, leaving a characteristic texture on the edges. A special cutter had to be made to imitate this feature. The most difficult task was reproducing photographs. German newspapers used high-quality halftone printing. Soviet specialists had to create their own technology for producing halftone plates that was as close as possible to the German one. This required the development of new chemical compositions and photographic processes. The psychological preparation of the content was no less important. A group of journalists and psychologists, led by Major Nikolai Ivanovich Sokolov, studied the peculiarities of the German mentality. They found out what topics were of most concern to German soldiers, what arguments could convince them, and what fears could be exploited. Fake issues of various German newspapers were created, from central publications to local leaflets. The fake issues of the Völkischer Beobachter, the main newspaper of the Nazi Party, proved particularly effective. Soviet craftsmen learned to reproduce its layout accurately, including complex decorative elements and party symbols. In addition to newspapers, fake personal letters, official documents, and even banknotes were produced. Each type of forgery required special technology. Letters were typed on typewriters captured in battle or purchased through neutral countries. Documents were stamped with fake seals and signatures that were indistinguishable from the real ones. The quality of the forgeries was so high that even specialists from the German counterintelligence services could not always recognize them. There is a known case when a fake issue of Das Reich was distributed among German officers for a week before the forgery was discovered. The work of the forgers was not limited to the war period. Their experience and technology were also used in the post-war period for the needs of foreign intelligence and political struggle. Many of the methods they developed are still studied by information security specialists as classic examples of technical perfection in the field of print forgery. The secret printing house on Ostozhenka operated until 1949, when its functions were transferred to other organizations. However, the technologies developed here and the experience gained became the basis for the development of the Soviet system of information and psychological operations for many decades to come. In the summer of 1943, one of the most ambitious psychological warfare operations began in the Moscow suburb of Krasnogorsk, the creation of the National Committee Free Germany. This organization was supposed to become the face of the German anti-fascist resistance, but in reality it was completely controlled by the Soviet Special Services. The idea belonged to Lieutenant General Ivan Ilyich Fedyuninsky, who understood that simple calls to surrender no longer worked on German soldiers. A more complex psychological operation was needed, based on the use of the authority of the Germans themselves, and such authority was found among the captured Wehrmacht officers. The central figure of the operation was Major General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 51st Army Corps, who was captured near Stalingrad. After lengthy talks with Soviet officers, he agreed to head an anti-Hitler committee of German prisoners of war. Dozens of German officers and generals participated in the committee's work alongside Seydlitz. Among them were the commander of the 9th Army Corps, Artillery General Walter Daniels, the commander of the 24th Tank Corps, Lieutenant General Martin Luttmann, and many colonels and lieutenant colonels. The Soviet supervisors of the operation created ideal working conditions for the committee. A modern radio center with powerful transmitters capable of broadcasting throughout Europe was set up in Krasnogorsk. A printing house was in operation, printing newspapers and leaflets in German. There was even a recording studio for preparing radio programs. The committee's main publication was the newspaper Free Germany, the first issue of which was published on July 19, 1943. Outwardly, it looked like a normal German newspaper, but the content was completely different. Instead of Nazi propaganda, readers found articles about the crimes of the Hitler regime and calls for resistance. The committee's radio broadcasts were particularly effective. The Free Germany station broadcast several hours a day on short and medium waves. The broadcasts featured speeches by captured German officers telling the truth about the situation at the front, the atrocities committed by the SS, and the futility of further resistance. The psychological effect was enormous. German soldiers heard the voices of their former commanders on the radio, calling on them to stop resisting. This was much more convincing than any Soviet appeals. Many Wehrmacht units began to surrender en masse. The committee issued special passes for those wishing to surrender. These documents, signed by German generals, guaranteed good treatment and compliance with international law. In the second half of 1943 alone, more than 50,000 German soldiers surrendered with such passes. A special focus of the committee's work was agitation among Germany's allies. Special sections were created to work with Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units. Captured officers from these armies were used to appeal to their compatriots to leave the war. The German command tried to counter the committee's influence. Severe punishments, including execution, were introduced for listening to Radio Free Germany. Special teams were set up to confiscate the committee's leaflets. However, it was impossible to stop the distribution of these materials, as they reached the front through partisan channels and a network of agents. The activities of the Free Germany Committee continued until the end of the war. According to Soviet command estimates, this organization played an important role in demoralizing the enemy and bringing victory closer. Many of its methods were later used in other psychological operations during the Cold War. May 1945. The war was over, but the psychological weapons of the USSR were not demobilized. On the contrary, with the beginning of the Cold War, this sphere received new development. Yesterday's allies had now become enemies, and the methods of influence had to be radically revised. The first post-war operations were carried out in occupied Germany. Soviet loudspeakers were used for propaganda among the population of the western sectors of Berlin. Powerful stations installed in the eastern part of the city broadcast programs in German criticizing the policies of the Western occupation authorities. Psychological weapons were used particularly actively during the Berlin crisis of 1948-1949. When the Western Allies organized an air bridge to supply West Berlin, Soviet specialists attempted to disrupt it with sound interference. Powerful loudspeakers were installed at Tempelhof and Gatow airfields to create acoustic interference for transport aircraft pilots. False commands were transmitted by air traffic controllers and distress signals were imitated. The goal was to force Western pilots to abandon their flights to Berlin. However, the Americans and British quickly developed countermeasures. They began to use radio communication on protected frequencies, and the most experienced pilots learned to ignore the noise interference. Moreover, the Western Allies began to use their own psychological weapons against the Soviet side. A real radio wave war unfolded in the 1950s. The USSR created a powerful network of radio stations broadcasting to foreign countries. Radio Moscow, Peace and Progress, and many local stations in the Soviet republics broadcast programs in dozens of languages. Particular attention was paid to radio propaganda in the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Soviet radio stations supported national liberation movements, criticized colonialism and neocolonialism, and promoted the socialist path of development. Western countries responded by creating their own radio stations: Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and the BBC, conducted active counterpropaganda. A real battle for the minds of people around the world began, with radio waves and sound programs serving as weapons. The USSR did not limit itself to radio propaganda. Mobile loudspeaker stations were set up to operate in border areas. They were used to agitate the population of neighboring capitalist countries, especially in Europe and Asia. During the Korean War, Soviet specialists helped the North Koreans and Chinese conduct psychological operations against UN troops. Powerful loudspeakers were used to broadcast programs in English to American soldiers. The content of the broadcasts was aimed at undermining morale and stimulating anti-war sentiments. Psychological weapons also developed technically. Transistor amplifiers appeared, allowing for the creation of more compact and mobile installations. Directional sound systems were developed that could deliver messages over long distances without dispersion. By the end of the 1950s, the USSR had created a powerful psychological warfare system capable of operating worldwide. It included radio stations, print propaganda, agents of influence, and technical means of sound warfare. This system existed until the end of the Cold War and played an important role in the ideological confrontation between the two systems. The mid-1950s. During the Cold War, the airwaves became a battlefield where ideas and words fought instead of tanks and planes. The USSR created a complex system of underground radio stations that were not officially connected to the Soviet leadership, but were actually completely controlled by Moscow. The center of this activity was a secret facility called Volga 77, located in a forest near Moscow. Officially, it was listed as a research institute of long-distance communications. But in reality, it was where radio programs for psychological operations around the world were prepared. The facility was headed by Colonel Pyotr Grigorievich Makarov, a former long-range aviation radio engineer. His team consisted of radio engineers, journalists, translators, and actors. They all worked on creating ghost radio stations, transmitters that pretended to be independent sources of information. The first such station was Radio Free Germany, which began broadcasting in 1952. Formally, it represented an underground anti-fascist organization in West Germany. But in reality, all programs were prepared in Moscow. The broadcasts were in German and were directed against the remilitarization of West Germany. The Voice of Arab Liberation Station, which broadcast to the Middle East, was particularly sophisticated. It presented itself as a radio station of the pan-Arab movement and supported anti-Western sentiments in the Arab world. The programs were broadcast in literary Arabic, with different dialects for different regions. The technical support for these stations was of the highest standard. Separate transmission complexes with unique technical characteristics were created for each ghost radio station. This made it possible to simulate broadcasting from different geographical locations and made it difficult for Western intelligence services to locate the stations. The content of the broadcasts was prepared taking into account local characteristics and the mentality of the target audience. Special editorial offices were set up for each country, staffed by people from the relevant regions or people who were very familiar with local specifics. Particular attention was paid to news programs. Soviet specialists learned to present real events in the right light, without resorting to outright lies. They used half-truths, omitting some facts and exaggerating others, and added emotional coloring to the presentation of the material. The creation of a network of interconnected stations that seemed to confirm each other's information proved effective. One station would report a piece of news. Another would confirm it with reference to independent sources, and a third would provide expert commentary. Listeners were given the impression that they were receiving information from sources. Western intelligence agencies tried to combat Soviet ghost radio stations. Radio jamming was used, transmitters were tracked, and program content was analyzed. But it was not possible to completely jam these stations. The USSR used backup transmitters, jumped from frequency to frequency, and changed broadcast times. Radio plays continued until the end of the Cold War. According to various estimates, the USSR simultaneously controlled between 20 and 30 underground radio stations broadcasting to various regions of the world. They played an important role in shaping anti-Western sentiments in many third world countries. With the beginning of perestroika, most of these stations were closed. However, the experience gained from radio plays was not lost. Many methods of psychological influence via radio continue to be used in modern information wars. On December 27, 1979, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, and psychological warfare units arrived in the country along with them. The Afghan conflict became a kind of laboratory for testing new methods and means of influencing the enemy in guerrilla warfare. Psychological operations were led by Colonel Vladimir Ivanovich Sokolov, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War with extensive experience in this field. His task was not only to demoralize the Mujahideen, but also to win the sympathy of the local population, without whose support the guerrillas could not survive. The first months showed that methods effective against a regular army did not work well in Afghanistan. The guerrillas did not sit in trenches where they could be targeted by loudspeakers. They blended in with the civilian population, constantly moved around, and took advantage of the difficult mountain terrain. It was necessary to develop fundamentally new technical means. Portable loudspeaker systems were developed that could be carried in a backpack. Airships with powerful loudspeakers capable of operating over mountain gorges were created. Even helicopters with suspended acoustic systems were used. Particular attention was paid to studying Afghan culture and psychology. It turned out that traditional methods of propaganda did not work here. Afghans were distrustful of any information coming from foreigners. More subtle methods of influence were needed. The breakthrough came when Soviet specialists began to use local religious and cultural traditions. Instead of communist slogans, quotations from the Quran and calls for peace and harmony were broadcast. Loyal mullahs were recruited to explain that war was contrary to Islamic principles. Spreading rumors proved effective. Afghan society was very receptive to unofficial information passed on by word of mouth. Soviet specialists learned how to create and launch rumors, which then spread throughout the country naturally. Print propaganda was also adapted to local conditions. Instead of newspapers, bright leaflets with simple drawings were produced, as many Afghans were illiterate. The content was simplified as much as possible and adapted to the local mentality. A special focus was placed on working with captured mujahideen. Special camps were set up for former guerrilla fighters, where they underwent psychological processing. Methods of persuasion based on Islamic principles were used, films about peaceful life in the USSR were shown, and meetings with representatives of Soviet Muslim republics were organized. The use of radio-controlled devices was a new development in psychological operations. Small transmitters were created, which were dropped in mountainous areas and broadcast recorded programs. These devices operated autonomously for several weeks, creating the illusion of a constant Soviet presence. Much attention was paid to counter-propaganda. The Mujahideen actively used foreign radio stations to spread anti-Soviet information. Soviet specialists jammed these broadcasts and prepared refutations of the most dangerous messages. The use of music proved to be an effective method. Afghans were very fond of folk songs, and Soviet specialists began to include them in their broadcasts. However, the lyrics were adapted to speak of peace and friendship between peoples, and condemn those who brought suffering to ordinary people. Particular attention was paid to working with tribal leaders. Afghan society had a clan structure, and the opinion of the elders was very important. Soviet specialists studied the genealogy of influential families, their traditional ties and conflicts, in order to use this information in psychological operations. Technical progress did not stand still. By the mid-1980s, the first computer systems for analyzing the effectiveness of propaganda appeared. They made it possible to process large amounts of information about the mood of the population and adjust the content of broadcasts depending on the audience's reaction. The Afghan experience showed the importance of cultural adaptation of psychological weapons. Methods that were effective in Europe proved to be inapplicable in Asian societies, with their unique traditions and values. It was necessary to develop fundamentally new approaches to psychological influence. By the end of the 1980s, Soviet specialists had accumulated unique experience in conducting psychological operations in asymmetric conflicts. This experience was summarized in special manuals and textbooks used to train special services personnel. The Afghan war ended, but the knowledge gained did not disappear. Many of the methods and principles developed during this conflict were later used in other regions of the world, where the USSR and Russia were involved in conflict resolution. The 1980s were a time of revolutionary changes in the field of psychological weapons. The advent of microprocessors, digital technologies, and satellite communications opened up fundamentally new possibilities for influencing the enemy's consciousness. The USSR could not remain on the sidelines of this technological breakthrough. The world's first digital psychological operations control system was created at the Impulse Special Design Bureau under the leadership of chief designer Anatoly Sergeyevich Volkov. It was codenamed Echo and consisted of a complex of powerful computers capable of processing huge amounts of information. The Echo system made it possible to analyze the effectiveness of various types of influence in real time. Special sensors located in the areas where operations were being carried out recorded the population's reaction to propaganda broadcasts. The computer processed this data and automatically adjusted the content of the programs. The introduction of digital sound recording was revolutionary. Whereas previously analog tape recorders with limited recording quality had to be used, it was now possible to create recordings of perfect quality. This was particularly important for imitating the voices of real people, politicians, military commanders, and religious leaders. A major breakthrough occurred in the field of directional sound. Using phased antenna arrays, Soviet engineers created devices capable of focusing sound waves in a very narrow sector. Such a sound beam could deliver messages to a specific person at a distance of several kilometers, while those around them heard nothing. The first examples of subliminal influence appeared. Special generators created ultra-low frequency sounds that were inaudible to the human ear, but affected the nervous system. These infrasonic vibrations could cause anxiety, fear, depression, or, conversely, euphoria and relaxation. Computer technology made it possible to create the first automatic speech recognition and synthesis systems. Now it was possible to translate propaganda messages into dozens of languages in real time, adapt them to local dialects, and even imitate the voices of specific people. Satellite communications opened up new possibilities for coordinating psychological operations. A single control center in Moscow could simultaneously direct dozens of operations around the world, instantly transmit new programs, and receive reports on the effectiveness of the impact. Special attention was paid to the miniaturization of equipment. Portable complexes were created that could fit into a standard diplomatic briefcase. Such devices could be used by agents in foreign countries to carry out targeted psychological operations. Means of protection against enemy psychological influence were also developed. Special detectors were created that could detect attempts at subliminal influence, jammers to block enemy transmissions, and psychological rehabilitation systems for people who had been subjected to processing. By the end of the 1980s, the USSR had the most advanced psychological warfare system in the world. It included powerful transmission centers, mobile complexes, satellite communication systems, and computer information processing centers. This system could influence any point on the planet. However, with the beginning of perestroika and the subsequent collapse of the USSR, many developments were curtailed or classified. Some of the technology fell into the hands of Western special services, and some was lost forever. But the accumulated experience and knowledge became the basis for the development of modern information technologies and mass communication. Deep in the Siberian taiga, 200 kilometers from Novosibirsk, was one of the most secret facilities in the USSR, the Raduga Research Center. Officially, it did not exist, appearing in documents as Forestry Number 237. In reality, research was being conducted here that could change the very concept of psychological warfare. The center was headed by academician Boris Petrovich Lebedev, a leading expert in neurophysiology and biophysics. His team consisted of scientists from various fields, including physicists, biologists, psychologists, and engineers. They were all working on the creation of fundamentally new means of influencing the human consciousness. The main focus of the research was the study of electromagnetic effects on the human brain. Scientists discovered that brain activity is accompanied by weak electrical impulses of a certain frequency. Theoretically, by exposing the brain to electromagnetic fields of the appropriate parameters, it was possible to influence a person's mental state. The first experiments were conducted on volunteers from among the center's employees. The results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Weak electromagnetic pulses of a certain frequency caused various emotional states in the test subjects, ranging from euphoria to deep depression, from calmness to panic. Experiments involving the effects on memory proved particularly interesting. Scientists discovered that certain electromagnetic fields could block the formation of new memories, or, conversely, enhance memory retention. This opened up fantastic possibilities for creating controllable people. At the same time, research was conducted in the field of psychoacoustics, the study of the effects of sounds on the human subconscious. It was found that certain combinations of frequencies and rhythms can cause changes in brain activity similar to the effects of narcotic substances or hypnosis. Experimental models of psychotronic weapons were created, devices capable of influencing the human psyche using electromagnetic fields. The first prototypes were bulky and required a powerful energy source, but gradually they were miniaturized. Particular attention was paid to the development of means of mass influence. In theory, it was possible to create a transmitter capable of simultaneously affecting thousands of people within a radius of several kilometers. Such a device could instantly suppress unrest, paralyze an enemy army, or force the population to support the necessary political decisions. Experiments were conducted on remote influence. Scientists tried to find out whether it was possible to influence a person in another city or even another country, using powerful transmitters and satellite communications. Preliminary results showed that such a possibility existed. Methods of protection against psychotronic influence were developed. Special shielding materials were created to block electromagnetic fields. Drugs were developed to increase the nervous system's resistance to external influences, and technical means were devised to detect attempts at psychotronic attacks. By the end of the 1980s, the Raduga Center had created prototypes of weapons that seemed like science fiction. Portable emotion generators capable of inducing desired feelings in a person from a distance. Memory-blocking devices that erased memories of past events. Transmitters of control commands that forced people to perform certain actions. However, these developments were not widely used. The Soviet leadership feared the unpredictable consequences of using such powerful weapons. In addition, many of the effects had not yet been fully studied, and there was a danger of harming their own troops and population. With the collapse of the USSR, the Raduga Center was disbanded, and most of its developments were classified. Some of the scientists emigrated to the West, taking their unique knowledge with them. Some of the documents were destroyed, but rumors about Soviet psychotronic weapons still stir the minds of conspiracy theorists and researchers of anomalous phenomena. The 1990s. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, but the psychological weapon system it created did not disappear without a trace. The accumulated knowledge, developed technologies, and trained personnel became the basis for new information wars that unfolded in the era of globalization and the Internet. Many specialists who worked in Soviet psychological warfare structures continued their activities in the new conditions after the collapse of the country. Some of them went to work for the Russian Special Services, some emigrated and offered their services to Western countries, and some founded private companies specializing in information technology. The experience of creating fake printed materials proved particularly valuable. In the Internet age, this knowledge has been transformed into technologies for creating fake news, fake websites, and fake social media accounts. Principles developed back in the 1940s have found new expression in the digital world. Radiopropaganda methods have also remained relevant. Shortwave transmitters have been replaced by internet radio stations, podcasts, and streaming services. But the basic principles remain the same: building trust in the source of information, emotionally influencing the audience, and gradually changing public opinion. Targeted sound technology has found applications beyond the military sphere. It is now used to disperse demonstrations, combat terrorism, and even for commercial purposes, such as targeted advertising in shopping malls. Research in the field of infrasound has led to the creation of non-lethal weapons for law enforcement agencies. Computer technologies for psychological influence developed particularly rapidly. Big data analysis systems made it possible to study the behavior of millions of people on the Internet, identify their preferences, fears, and weaknesses. This information was used to create personalized advertising campaigns and political programs. Fundamentally new opportunities for mass influence have emerged. Social networks have become the ideal medium for disseminating the desired information. Recommendation system algorithms made it possible to slip certain content to users, gradually shaping their opinions on various issues. Artificial intelligence opened up new horizons for psychological operations. Neural networks learned to create fake videos and audio recordings that were indistinguishable from the real thing. Chatbots could hold hours-long conversations with people without revealing their artificial nature. Machine learning systems analyzed texts and created personalized messages for each recipient. However, technological developments have also given rise to new problems. The information space has become so saturated that people have begun to lose the ability to distinguish truth from lies. The problem of post-truth has emerged, where emotional impact has become more important than the factual accuracy of information. modern states have been forced to create special services to combat disinformation. Algorithms for automatically detecting fake news are being developed, fact-checking centers are being created, and laws on responsibility for spreading false information are being introduced. The Soviet Union's experience in psychological warfare is being studied in military academies and universities around the world. Many of the principles and methods developed by Soviet specialists have become classics and are included in textbooks on information security and mass communication psychology. The era of the internet and social media has shown that psychological weapons can be just as destructive as conventional weapons. In some cases, an information attack can destabilize entire states, provoke mass unrest, and change election results. Therefore, studying the history and development of this field remains an extremely important task for understanding the modern world. Today, in the 21st century, we can appreciate the true significance of the psychological weapons created in the USSR. This unique system, which originated in the 1920s, has come a long way and left a deep mark on human history. Soviet specialists were pioneers in the systematic study and application of psychological influence. They were the first to understand that, in modern warfare, victory is achieved not only with fire and steel, but also by influencing the enemy's consciousness. This concept was decades ahead of its time. The technical achievements of Soviet engineers in the field of acoustics and radio engineering laid the foundations for many modern technologies. The principles of directional sound, developed in the 1940s, are used today in navigation systems for the blind, in medical equipment, and in virtual reality devices. Methods for creating fake printed materials, perfected by Soviet masters, became the forerunners of modern deepfake and synthetic media technologies. The principles of psychological influence through text formed the basis of modern neuromarketing and political technologies. The experience of Soviet radio propaganda had a huge impact on the development of mass communications around the world. Many techniques developed by Soviet specialists are now used by television channels, internet platforms, and advertising agencies to influence audiences. But the history of Soviet psychological weapons is not just about technical achievements. It is a lesson about how knowledge can be used both for good and for evil. Technologies created to defend the fatherland could become a tool for manipulating the minds of peaceful people. The modern world faces new challenges in the field of information security. The internet and social networks have created unprecedented opportunities for mass influence on people's minds. In this context, studying historical experience becomes particularly important. The lessons of Soviet psychological warfare are still relevant today. They teach us to be critical of the information we receive, to check sources, and to analyze the motives of those who try to influence our opinions. They show that protection against information warfare begins with education and the development of critical thinking. The legacy of Soviet psychological warfare specialists lives on in the work of modern researchers, journalists, and information security specialists. Their experience helps us understand the mechanisms of disinformation dissemination, develop methods of protection against manipulation, and create ethical standards for information technology. The history of psychological weapons in the USSR is part of the history of human knowledge. It shows how people studied the mysteries of the human psyche and how they learned to influence the conscious and subconscious mind. This knowledge can be used both for destruction and for creation. In our time, when information technology is developing at an unprecedented rate, it is important to remember the lessons of the past. Psychological weapons have not disappeared. They have transformed, becoming more sophisticated and accessible. The only protection against them is education, critical thinking, and an understanding of the history of these technologies. In concluding our discussion of the psychological weapons of the USSR, we must acknowledge that this was one of humanity's most ambitious attempts to understand and exploit the laws of the human psyche. The successes and failures of this project have become valuable experience for all subsequent generations of researchers and practitioners in the field of information technology.